Winter of 1944. Deep in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, German forces mocked the American soldiers who were tightly surrounded. They didn't know that just days later, a U.S. general would silence that laughter in the middle of a snowstorm. His name was George S. Patton. At the time, Allied commanders could hardly believe their ears. They thought Patton was boasting, or worse, had lost his mind. Even German generals laughed. Hitler's surprise attack had carved a massive hole in the Allied front line in the Ardennes, what the press would later call the Bulge. Germans believed they had just created the perfect strategic victory. They thought the winter counteroffensive would split the American and British armies and force the Allies to negotiate peace. After all, who could possibly stop 3 German armies with 250,000 troops and over 1,000 tanks storming through the frozen forest toward Antwerp? But there was one thing they didn't know. George Patton was waiting for his moment. And in the harshest European winter in years, with temperatures below freezing and skies thick with snow, it would be this general who stopped the German wave, turning Hitler's final gamble into the Axis' greatest disaster on the Western Front. This is the story of how Patton's Third Army turned the white snow of the Ardennes red and transformed Germany's reckless assault into America's most glorious victory in World War II. When destiny called his name at Ardennes, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. was 59 years old. Born in 1885 into a military family, Patton spent his entire life preparing for a moment when the fate of hundreds of thousands would depend on the brilliance of one man. By December 1944, he was commanding the Third Army, with over 250,000 troops and hundreds of tanks, and was considered the most daring tank commander among the Allies. But December 16, 1944, changed everything. As Patton's forces pushed through the Saar region, preparing to punch into Germany's industrial heartland, Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein. In the frigid darkness, 29 German divisions suddenly smashed into the thin American lines in the Ardennes. The German plan was incredibly bold: to push 60 miles through Belgium and Luxembourg, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the British and American forces. What made the attack terrifying wasn't just its scale, it was the element of complete surprise. Allied intelligence had failed to detect the massive German troop buildup, as they moved only at night and kept strict radio silence. When the first artillery shells exploded, the Americans were caught completely off guard. Within hours, German armored units had broken through the lines, swept aside American positions, and created chaos in the Allied command structure. By December 19th, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting in Verdun. The situation was worse than ever. German forces had advanced 20 miles into Belgium, threatening vital supply routes, and especially the town of Bastogne. Several American units had collapsed, and defensive lines were crumbling. If the momentum wasn't stopped, the Germans could reach Antwerp and divide the Allies. But while others were shaken, one man was ready. George Patton, who had spent a lifetime preparing for that moment, knew this was his hour of destiny. From his early days as a young officer, he had studied military geniuses like Napoleon, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, and always believed he was born to lead in a time of despair. His World War I experience, where he led America's first tank unit, taught Patton the true power of mechanized warfare and rapid assault. The road that brought him to the Ardennes was anything but easy. After brilliant victories in North Africa and Sicily, Patton was demoted for slapping 2 soldiers suffering from shell shock, an incident that nearly ended his career. He was sidelined for the D-Day invasion. Yet his tactical genius and iron will made him the most feared general among the Germans. They believed Patton was America's ace, and the Allies even used him as a decoy in deception plans, tricking the Germans into thinking the invasion would come at Calais instead of Normandy. By the time the Third Army entered France in July 1944, Patton had learned to channel his temper into a fierce command presence. Unlike many generals who stayed far from the action, he often went to the front lines himself, driving his jeep through mud and shell fire to inspire his troops. He believed a soldier must see his general sharing the danger. Because of this, the Third Army advanced 600 miles in just 4 months, liberating thousands of square miles of France and capturing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. But by fall 1944, the advance slowed due to fuel shortages, lack of ammunition, and fierce resistance at Metz. Many began to doubt whether Patton was merely a brilliant pursuer, unable to stand toe-to-toe with a determined enemy. They were wrong. The winter battle at Ardennes would be the ultimate proof that George S. Patton was not just a reckless warrior, but a true master of strategy. In a cold room in Verdun, mid-December 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower looked around the war table, his stern gaze sweeping across maps covered in red pins. The air was heavy. Hitler's surprise offensive had shaken the Allied front. "How soon can you pivot forces to counterattack north?" Eisenhower asked, his voice low and firm. No one answered right away. The generals glanced at each other in silence. Some lowered their heads. Others flipped through maps looking for answers. Then George S. Patton looked up, eyes sharp as steel, and said crisply, 3 days, sir." The room went dead silent. A few chuckled skeptically. Others sighed. 3 days to shift an entire army fighting in another direction? Madness. But Patton wasn't joking. While others were reacting, he had already prepared. His staff had noticed unusual German activity and secretly drawn up 3 contingency plans for a counteroffensive. He didn't wait for disaster. He anticipated it. To Patton, war was constant preparation. He always believed luck favored the prepared. While many commanders were still trying to grasp what was happening, Patton saw opportunity in the chaos. If the Germans advanced too far, they would bury themselves in the snow. As he left the meeting, Patton strode down the ice-covered hallway, wind whipping against his coat. Turning to his aide, he said, "Call headquarters." Order. Play ball. Those 2 short words crackled through the radio like thunder in the frozen sky. Play ball, the launch signal for one of the greatest counteroffensives in history. Within hours, over 133,000 vehicles of the Third Army began moving. The 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 81st Infantry Divisions all pivoted 90 degrees, marching over 100 miles through snow and ice. Tens of thousands of supply trucks followed in long convoys stretching for miles, carrying over 60,000 tons of fuel, ammo, and rations, an enormous war machine rolling through a white hell. American soldiers marched in silence, the sound of tank treads grinding ice and snow mixed with the howling wind, forming a metallic symphony of power. They had no warm coats. Boots had frozen stiff, weapons sometimes jammed with frozen oil. But they moved forward because they believed in Patton. Temperatures dropped to -7 degrees Celsius, wind stinging their faces, snow so thick they couldn't see the man ahead. Soldiers rubbed their hands raw to stay warm. One joked grimly, "If the Germans don't shoot us, the cold will." But even in that nightmare, Patton appeared every day. He drove an open-top Jeep through the snow, scarf flying, a cold grin under his helmet. A soldier recalled, "He drove past, snow spraying everywhere, shouting, 'Move it, boys! Nothing's colder than a delayed victory.'" That phrase spread like fire through the camps. Wherever Patton went, morale soared. They didn't just see their general, they saw the belief that they could win. Patton knew that in war, spirit outweighed artillery, and he was the spark. One officer wrote in his diary, "General Patton was everywhere, fields, trenches, snowy roads. We don't know when he sleeps. Maybe he doesn't. He only fights." The farther they marched, the more they felt they were doing the impossible. And that belief made it real. A 19-year-old soldier wrote home, "If General Patton's still out there, we've got no reason to stop." Word spread quickly. "The old man says we're the best soldiers in the world." That line became an unwritten order, pushing every man to march harder, fight fiercer, endure longer. Patton wasn't just a commander, he was the soul of the Third Army. But behind the fire was a mind cold and precise. Patton understood the fatal flaw in Hitler's plan, fuel, and time. The Germans had only 6 days' worth of gasoline, and if they didn't seize Allied supply depots, the offensive would collapse. Patton chose a bold strategy, not to engage the strongest spearhead directly, but to strike the base of the Bulge where German logistics were weakest. If successful, he wouldn't just save Bastogne, he could snap the entire German offensive. It was a move that defied every military textbook, but it was the move of a genius. 3 days later, the Third Army completed its lightning pivot. The massive machine of hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and artillery, moved with the precision of an orchestra, conducted by one hand. Patton's. German General Erich Brandenberger, upon hearing the news, couldn't believe it. He later admitted, "We thought Americans relied only on material. But after Ardennes, we realized they had something we once prided ourselves on: will and spirit, and the man who embodied that was Patton." Play ball wasn't just a code word. It was the declaration of a man who believed willpower could bend fate. And in just 3 days, Patton proved he was right, not with words, but with action. But Patton's lightning-fast troop maneuver stunned the entire world. Not only the Allies, even German commanders couldn't believe an entire army could move so quickly in the harshest winter of the century. General Erich Brandenberger, commander of Germany's 7th Army, later admitted that Patton fought in the true German style, bold, fast, and relentless. The Germans had once scoffed at the Americans, thinking they relied only on material comfort and logistics, and would crumble without convenience. But the winter of 1944 proved the opposite. Under a general like Patton, Americans could fight with iron resolve and courage equal to any soldier on Earth. At the center of the snowstorm, the town of Bastogne became the flashpoint of the entire front. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division was surrounded on all sides. No supplies, no escape route. Snow knee-deep, the cold pierced armor and froze metal stiff. The Germans sent an ultimatum, demanding surrender to avoid unnecessary casualties. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commander of the besieged forces, gave a 2-word reply: "Nuts." A short, sharp rejection that punched the pride of the Germans in the face. When the news reached Patton, he simply smiled and said to an officer beside him, "Great answer. Now let's go rescue them." On December 22, 1944, in the midst of a blinding snowstorm, Patton ordered the attack. 3 of his divisions launched a counteroffensive along a 30-kilometer front, striking at the German flank. The freezing wind cut like blades, snow erased visibility, yet tank engines roared and battle cries rang out like thunder. On the first day alone, American forces pushed the enemy back over 10 kilometers and reclaimed key positions. Sherman tanks slid across ice fields, clashing with German Tigers and Panthers in the blinding white. Exploding shells mixed black smoke with white snow, painting a scene both horrifying and majestic. Soldiers on both sides fought in a frozen hell. Many wounded refused evacuation, simply wrapping bandages and continuing to fire. American troops, short on food and sleep for days, huddled in blankets, pressed together for warmth. One joked, "If Patton can take the cold, we can too." They laughed hoarsely amid shell fire. In that storm, Patton did the unthinkable. He ordered the Army chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, to write a prayer for better weather. "We can't fight if the skies don't clear." "Talk to God for me," he said. O'Neill thought it was a joke, but Patton, dead serious, replied, "I've never joked about war, and never with God." The prayer was written, short but full of faith. "Almighty Father, we humbly beseech Thee to restrain these immoderate rains. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee for help in the hour of need, that we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies." Of thousands of copies were printed and distributed. Soldiers read it in tents, in trenches, under enemy fire. And then, the miracle came. On the morning of December 23rd, the clouds parted. For the first time in weeks, the sky was clear. Sunlight struck the snow-covered battlefield, reflecting like glass. The Allied air forces launched instantly. Hundreds of P-47s and B-26 rained bombs on German supply lines, tanks, convoys, and command posts. American soldiers looked up, cheering, some with tears. They believed God had heard Patton. 3 days later, on the frigid morning of December 26, 1944, the tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Charles Bulge, broke through the German line and entered Bastogne. The opening was just 500 yards wide, but it was the road to freedom. As the first tank rolled in, the 101st soldiers rushed out, laughing and crying. "You made it!" they shouted in the falling snow. Tight embraces, snow-caked faces, and American flags waving beneath a clear blue sky. Bastogne was relieved. But for Patton, that victory wasn't enough. Looking at the map, he saw the Germans had pushed too deep, and now had no way back. He turned to General Omar Bradley and said, "Brad, this time they've stuck their heads in the meat grinder, and I've got my hand on the crank." From that moment, the counterattack became a relentless pursuit. Patton ordered no halts, day or night, snow or storm. "As long as you see the enemy, you advance," he commanded. Every meter gained meant more hope, one step closer to final victory. When Bastogne was relieved, the snow still fell. But within the hearts of the American troops, the fire of victory had ignited. Patton didn't let anyone stop. To him, rescuing Bastogne was only the beginning. "We didn't come here just to survive. We came to win," he said in a brief frontline meeting. his eyes locked on the map stained with red marks, finger pointing north. The Germans pushed too far. Now we'll drive them out of every inch they stole. In the days that followed, snow blanketed the battlefield. Every road, every valley became a contested ground. American artillery roared without pause, shaking the leafless forests, while infantry pressed forward through biting winds, frozen mud, and charred tank husks. On some nights, the wind through the woods sounded like the moans of 10,000 restless souls. The Ardennes campaign had aged 20-year-old boys into old men in a single winter. Yet they never retreated, because behind them was Patton, and ahead lay freedom. Day by day, the German forces weakened. They lacked fuel, lacked ammunition, and lacked faith. Abandoned convoys lined the roads. German troops staggered on foot, some wrapped only in thin coats against the deadly cold. Sensing the moment like a predator, Patton struck. He ordered the counterattack expanded. "Don't let them pull back," he commanded. "They walked into the trap. Now we just shut the door." His counteroffensive became a true storm. Each American division surged forward like a wave, crushing resistance and driving the Germans back toward the Ardennes woods. Soldiers later recalled they no longer felt the cold. The adrenaline, the blasts, and the euphoria of momentum made them forget everything. Some snatched a bite of hard biscuit before charging again. Some fell in the snow, silent, smiling, fingers still clutching their rifles. Patton was always there, moving between units, his voice booming from Jeep loudspeakers. "Move forward. Don't let the weather stop you. The cold is a challenge. But victory is forever." His words became fuel, pushing men past their physical limits. For 6 straight weeks, snow kept falling. Forests once lush now lay bare, cratered by shell fire. The ground was white, speckled with red. Some said the snow in Ardennes had changed color, no longer white, but tinted with deep crimson. That was the price of victory. By mid-January 1945, the outcome was clear. Patton's forces from the south linked up with Allied troops from the north at the town of Houffalize. The Bulge, the last German breakthrough, was erased from the map. Hitler's final offensive collapsed completely. Germany lost over 100,000 troops, 700 tanks, and more than 1,600 aircraft. Many elite divisions were annihilated. The Nazi regime had thrown everything it had left into the Ardennes, and lost it all. It was their last gamble, and they lost everything. Meanwhile, the American army, though battered, had come of age. From clumsy recruits in 1942, they had become a hardened fighting force, disciplined, courageous, and unyielding. And at the center of that transformation was George S. Patton, the man who turned a weary army into America's steel-tipped spear. Those who once doubted him now had to admit, no one else could have done it. The feat of pivoting 6 divisions in 72 hours, marching through ice while remaining combat-ready, was hailed as one of the greatest logistical achievements in modern military history. As the battle died down, Patton wrote to his wife, "Fate called my name when things turned grim. Perhaps God kept me alive for this very moment." To him, the Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a victory, it was a validation of a life devoted to war. Proof that belief, preparation, and indomitable spirit could shift the tide of an entire conflict. Winston Churchill, a man rarely generous with praise for Americans, declared, "The Battle of the Bulge is the greatest American battle of the war." But to Patton, that victory wasn't just about national pride. It was proof of a deeper truth, that the human will, when properly led, could overcome cold, darkness, and fear. When the final winter sun rose over the forests of the Ardennes, snow still clung to the wreckage of burned tanks, and the American flag flew proudly beneath the pale blue sky. They say in that light, Patton stood silently for a long time. He looked over the battlefield and gave a quiet nod. No words were needed. The victory had spoken for him. The Battle of the Bulge ended, but its echoes, and the name George S. Patton, would live forever in human history. The Battle of the Bulge ended, but its echo never faded. In that European winter, amid ruined villages and snow-laden forests, people said, when the snow melted, Germany had lost its faith. Hitler's final counteroffensive had failed, and from that moment history's wheels began rolling straight toward Berlin. But in the hearts of Americans, that victory was more than a military milestone. It was a reminder of grit, resolve, and belief in righteousness. For George S. Patton, the victory in the Ardennes was the pinnacle of a lifetime, living proof of what he had always believed. There are no hopeless situations, only people who lose courage. Where others saw defeat, he saw opportunity. Where others feared, he saw challenge. And when winter wrapped Europe in darkness, he turned it into a season of triumph. Many called Patton America's madman, a man who only knew how to attack and never retreat. But perhaps that very madness saved Europe. He didn't lead by orders alone, but by a belief that radiated from deep within his own heart. The soldiers who marched through the Ardennes never forgot the sight of Patton standing in the blizzard, his red scarf whipping in the wind, hand pointing forward, voice thundering. No one ever won a war by defending. We win by attacking. That wasn't just a slogan. It was a way of life, the embodiment of the American spirit in its darkest hour. After the war, many asked, what did Patton do to become a legend? The answer was simple. He never gave up. In his diary, he once wrote, "I'm not afraid of war. I'm only afraid of not being in it." It sounds arrogant, but it held the soul of a man born to carry a nation's fate. To him, war wasn't about glory. It was proof that human will could accomplish the impossible. Years passed. But whenever winter 1944 is remembered, so is Patton and the Third Army, the men who marched through frozen hell to bring back the light. They fought through numbing cold, chewed rock-hard rations, slept on frozen ground, and woke to enemy fire, only to find Patton already out there before them. He never asked his men to do what he himself wouldn't. And that, perhaps more than anything, made him revered. Winston Churchill, who had seen dozens of great generals in his lifetime, declared, "The Battle of the Bulge is the greatest American battle." But to Patton, it wasn't just a win. It was destiny fulfilled. A moment he had waited his whole life for, where belief, courage, and leadership converged to create a miracle that made the world take notice. Later, when veterans of the Ardennes were asked what helped them survive, many answered, "Because we believed in Patton." Just 4 words, but they said everything. Patton wasn't just a general. He was the spirit of America in its darkest chapter. He stood for the belief that when people have purpose, they can endure any winter, any cold, any darkness. Those soldiers, though their names may be forgotten, built that victory with him. They were ordinary men, farmers, mechanics, students. But under Patton's command, they became heroes. They fought not just for orders, but for something greater, the pride of defending freedom for the entire world. When the last snow melted from the forests of Ardennes, the American flag flew brightly in the pale spring sun. Beneath the thawing ice lay the brown-red traces of war, not left by Americans, but by the retreating Germans. That victory didn't just end a battle, it proved something timeless, that America's true strength lies not in weapons, but in the hearts of those who never surrender. Patton once said, "There is no glory for the man who stands still, only victory for those who dare to move forward." And he moved, taking a whole generation with him. From that moment, the name George S. Patton became more than a part of a war. It became a symbol of belief that no matter how times change, courage and willpower remain the guiding light of humanity. Winter of 1944 passed, but Patton's spirit endured, burning quietly in the pages of history, in the hearts that still believe. Even in the darkest night, the light of courage can still shine.